We're going to be looking at chapters 11 and 12 this morning in the book of 2 Kings. Actually, you want me to stop and keep going? Okay. Actually, in chapters 11 through 16, now we're going to start in chapter 11 this morning. We'll be doing chapter 11 and chapter 12, but in chapters 11 through 16, there are actually 13 kings that are mentioned. And of those 13 kings, 5 of them are kings of Judah, and 8 are kings of Israel. And this is what makes it a little bit difficult to comprehend who is who, and which one is a king of Israel, which one is a king of Judah. But when we find right now in chapter 11, if you remember from last Sunday, Jehu kind of slaughtered everybody. Whether they were kings of Israel or even people of Judah. Remember, he went and he slew everybody in the house of Ahab, which of course were the kings of Israel, king of Israel. And then as he was traveling, he came across a group of people who actually were from Judah, and he slew them as well. And you'll notice that Ahaziah was king of Judah at the time, and he killed him too. So what was going to happen? And it was important for us to find out what happens to the line of Judah. Because if you recall what was said in the book of Samuel, that God said that there would be someone from Judah who would eventually be the ruler of all Israel, and that there would never be a day when a son of David would not be available to lead the nation. But what's going on here? I mean, after Jehu's rampage, he not only slew those of Israel, he slew those of Judah. So what's going to happen to God's promise? And what was that promise? Well, in Psalm 89, you notice what it says beginning in verse 35. Psalm 89, verse 35. Once for all, I have sworn by my holiness. This is God speaking. He said, once for all, I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. Like the moon, it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. So here you are, in the book of Psalms, you see God's promise that there will always be a child of David. His offspring will endure forever. Then you go over to Psalm 132, and notice what it says in Psalm 132. It says in verse 10 of Psalm 132, for the sake of your servant David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. So, once again, okay, how's this all going to happen after Jehu slew everybody? Well, let's go to chapter 11 of 2 Kings, and notice what it says in verse 1. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. So, you know, we thought that we were dealing with the worst wicked woman in all the Old Testament when Jezebel got slain. But here's one that's just as bad, if not worse than Jezebel, and it's Athaliah. Now, who is she? Well, she was the mother of Ahaziah. And being the mother of Ahaziah meant that she was married to Ahab. Now, guess what? You see, the king of Judah wanted to make an alliance with Ahab. And so what did he do? He gave his daughter to Ahab's child. All right, so Athaliah wasn't married to Ahab. She was Ahab's daughter, Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. And so she was actually married to a king of Judah. But guess what? She never followed the God of the Jews at all. She was still a worshiper of Baal. And it shows you what went wrong with this unholy alliance of Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother. What does she do? When she saw that her son was killed, what did she do? She slew all the other relatives. And why did she do that? Because she wanted to be queen. And so Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, the king of Judah was dead, so she arose and she destroyed all the royal family. Now, she was eliminating everybody that would have a claim to the throne, so she reigned as the mother, the queen, if you will, of the tribe of Judah. But there's a but in verse 2. So whenever you see it, it says, but Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah so that he was not put to death. So now you see what God is doing. God is continuing to fulfill his promise that David shall never lack one who was going to sit on the throne. So here's this little baby, and this little baby was taken, and it says that this Jehosheba, she was the daughter of King Joram and the sister of Ahaziah. But guess what? Guess who she married? She married Jehoiada. Jehoiada was the high priest. So when you see this lady, Jehosheba, in verse 2, she was married to the high priest. And what did she do? She took her nephew and hid him. It says that she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. This term, by the way, is not a bedroom that you sleep in. This was actually a storage room where all the bedroom furniture was kept. So it's not a bedroom that anybody slept in regularly. It was actually a storage room for all of the bedding and any of the bedroom furniture that was used in the palace. That's where she hid this baby. And she hid this baby for 7 years. So we're introduced to another person with a name that's hard to pronounce, Jehosheba. She took her nephew, stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death. She put him and his nurse in the bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So he was, I guess, I said he was a baby. He was approximately a year old because she hid him for 6 years, but by the time he was 7 years old, he was pronounced as the king of Judah. But I'm getting ahead of myself because we'll see that as we continue in the chapter. Verse 3. He remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. Isn't it interesting that he was hidden in the temple? And that was a great place to hide him in the temple because Athaliah would never darken the door of the temple. She worshiped Baal. So she would never go to the temple. So this is why this young child was actually hidden in the temple. Because Jehoshaphat, who was the wife of the high priest, knew that Athaliah would never go into the temple. So verse 4, but in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Karites and of the guards and had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them and put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son. So up to this point, nobody knew that he existed. Nobody knew about him except, of course, Jehoshaphat, and of course her husband would know. So the high priest and his wife knew of this child's existence, and so did his nurse. So what? There was at least 3 people that knew, but it was kept a secret, at least for those 6 years. But in the 7th year, the high priest Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Karites and of the guards. Now, who were the Karites? They're only mentioned one other time. They're mentioned in 1 Samuel. These were mercenaries. These were individuals, they were either from Phoenicia or Cilicia. And these were people who were loyal to Jehoiada. And these mercenaries, these guards, were there. And so what did the high priest decide to do? He says, I want to bring the captains of these mercenaries, and I want them to come to the house of the Lord. Once again, he could meet them in the temple because he knew that Athaliah would never be there. And he made a covenant with them, verse 4, and put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son, that is Ahaziah, who was killed. This was his son. Verse 5, and he commanded them, this is the thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you, those who come off duty on the Sabbath and guard the king's house, another 1/3 being at the gate Sur, and a 1/3 at the gate behind the guards, shall guard the palace. And the 2 divisions of you which come on duty in force on the Sabbath and guard the house of the Lord on behalf of the king shall surround the king, each with his weapons in his hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be put to death. Be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. And the captains did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And they each brought his men who were to go off duty on the Sabbath with those who were to come on duty on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And the priests gave to the captains the spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. So here's what's going on. Keep in mind that these Karites, these mercenaries, these guards, they had responsibility of covering the palace and covering the temple. They were guards to make sure that nothing happened to the king. And of course, the king was dead, but they were still there. And he said, okay, we're going to do this on the Sabbath because will have more guards, because he spoke to the guards that were going to go off duty, were there just before they went off duty. And then there was another group that were going to come and be on duty. So he told the guards that were going off duty, don't leave, stay here. So you had both the guards that were on duty and the guards that were going off duty. All right, so he made sure that there were enough of them to surround this boy when they brought him out. All right, because where did he live? He lived at the temple. So these guards, accustomed to being on duty for both the palace, which would have been next door to the temple. So they were from the palace as well as from the temple. So this whole group of guards were surrounding Jehoiada the priest. And what did the priest do? Look at what it says in verse 10. He gave to the captains the spears and the shields that had been King David's. So these spears and the shields were approximately 200 years old, because we're talking a couple of hundred years since King David. And these were all kept, a lot of things were kept from King David. He was actually the most popular king of Israel. And so keep in mind now that these old spears and shields were kept there for a reason, and here's one of the reasons they were kept there. So they were given to these guards. Verse 11, and the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, and from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house on behalf of the king. Then he brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, long live the king. All right, so now you get the picture. All the guards are there. They bring out this 7-year-old boy, they put the crown on his head, and they gave him the testimony. What is that? What does it mean they gave him the testimony? Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. So Deuteronomy chapter 17. Of course, we're still dealing in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy with the time of Moses, all right? So here we are, and this is what Moses says to the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 17, beginning at verse 14. Deuteronomy 17:14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers. You shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Now, if you remember when we were studying 1 Kings, who did all of this? Solomon. You know, he did exactly what God said through Moses not to do. You know, he acquired horses for himself. And where did he buy those horses from? He bought them from Egypt. So, you know, even King Solomon He did all of these things that he was not supposed to do. But let's continue in verse 18. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Now this is perhaps a portion that we might read and not really grasp what it's saying. But from the very beginning, this is what God commanded the kings of Israel to do. When they ascended the throne, they were to take a copy of the Ten Commandments and they were to rewrite them. Now, why would he ask them to do that? Well, wouldn't that put it more on their memory? If they were to take it and actually copy it word for word, and not only were they to copy it word for word, but they were to read it regularly. They were to read the law. They were not to step aside from it at all, either to the right hand or to the left. And so when it says in 2 Kings that when the son of Ahaziah was placed on the throne, he was not only given the crown to wear, but he was given a copy of the testimony. What was the testimony? It was the law. It was that law that he himself was to copy, was to write, and it was to stay in his mind and in his heart. So they put the crown on his head. They gave him a copy of the testimony, and they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." Now remember, we just said a little while ago that the palace was next door to the temple. So when all of the people were there, when this young boy was anointed as king. He, by the way, he was the youngest one anointed as king of Israel. Now, there was another king that was anointed at 8 years of age. But here he is at 7 years of age. And, of course, everybody in the temple was clapping and rejoicing and yelling, "Long live the king." And so next door, Athaliah, she hears all of this. So look at verse 13. When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar according to the custom. Which, by the way, and we noticed this in other kings, that when they were crowned as king, part of the coronation ceremony was actually having them stand next to the pillar of the temple. And so when Athaliah comes in, wanting to find out what's going on, she sees the king standing by the pillar according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason." Of course, she would think that because she claimed herself to be the queen. Verse 15. Then Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, "Bring her out between the ranks and put her to death with the sword, anyone who follows her." For the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." They didn't want to kill her right there. They didn't want to shed her blood in the house of the Lord. So they took her outside. So they took her outside, verse 16. They laid hands on her, and she went through the horses' entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death. Kind of reminiscent of her mother, Jezebel. You know, because remember when Jezebel was thrown out the window, we saw that. What happened? Her blood was spilled on some of the horses. And here again, we see that she went out to the horses' entrance of the king's house, and there she was put to death. And then look at what happens in verse 17. After Athaliah is put to death, the high priest, Jehoiada, verse 17, made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. Now I want you to notice that this is the third time that God's covenant was renewed with the people of Israel. Now God never needed to renew the covenant because he never broke it. But the people constantly broke the covenant. And so, you know, the covenant was given at Mount Sinai. And the law was given at Mount Sinai, you know, just when the people were barely into the promised land. That's what happened on Mount Sinai when God gave them the law. And they had that law from that time on, but many times the Israelites kind of broke that covenant. They didn't follow through on what the covenant had to say. So there were times when the covenant had to be renewed. Whenever they had a godly leader, that godly leader would renew the covenant. So in Deuteronomy, we're not going to take time to read that now, but in Deuteronomy, in chapters 27, 28, 29, and 30, those 4 chapters, it was the renewal of the covenant at Mount Ebal. They were there at Mount Ebal, and Moses said, it's time to renew that covenant. It's time, Israel. You know, you've been going through the wilderness, and all you've been doing is complaining about the fact that we used to eat really well in Egypt, and now all we have is this manna to eat, and every once in a while we'll have a quail to eat. So there was all of this complaining. And Moses said it's time to renew that covenant. So when they were gathered at Mount Ebal, in Deuteronomy chapter 27 all the way through chapter 30, they renewed that covenant with the Lord under Moses' leadership. And then once they arrived in the promised land, they renewed it again under Joshua. And in Joshua chapter 24, they gathered together at Shechem. So the first renewal of the covenant was at Mount Ebal. The second renewal of the covenant was under Joshua. And the 24th chapter, the last chapter of the book of Joshua, was once again renewing that covenant under Joshua's leadership. And now, under the leadership of Jehoiada, the high priest, they renewed the covenant there in Jerusalem. And so here they are. This is the third time now that they are renewing that covenant. And of course, the reason that it had to be renewed all that time is how the Israelites so often would kind of ignore that covenant. And the godly leadership had to bring them back to understand what that covenant was all about. And so, back now in 2 Kings 11, verse 17, Jehoiada renewed that covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. Then all the people, verse 18, then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore down his altars and his images. They broke in pieces, and they killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. Now, keep in mind now, this house of Baal that they tore down was in the south. Remember earlier they tore the house of Baal down. If you remember, in the last couple of weeks we talked about how the Israelites tore down the house of Baal when Ahab was slain. But that was in the north, that was in Samaria. Here's another house of Baal that's in Jerusalem, that's in the southern part of Israel. And this is the one that is torn down. Now back in chapter 10, we saw when in verse 27, where it says they demolished the pillar of Baal and demolished the house of Baal and made it a latrine. We saw that last week, right? But that was in Samaria. Now they're in Jerusalem, and so they destroyed the house of Baal there. Because keep in mind that if one is following God, if one is honoring God, they destroy that which dishonors God. They got rid of that which would cause temptation for the people. And so the house of Baal was taken and torn down. And verse 19 says, he took the captains and the Carites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he took his seat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house. Jehoash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Now you'll notice there have been times when you'll see two names of the same person. I mean, we've done that. You know, Robert and Bob, same guy, right? William and Bill. And likewise, the same thing is happening here. Sometimes you'll see Joash, just Joash, and sometimes it is spelled Jehoash, Jehoash, but they're the same person. And so what's happening here? It says that he was protected. I mean, here's an interesting thing. Joash, he was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. He ended up being one of the longest of the kings. One of them. He wasn't the longest, but he was one of the longest. He reigned for 40 years. He started when he was 7 years old. He reigned until he died when he was 47. But I want you to notice that there are certain things that happened to the kings of Israel that also happened to the Lord Jesus Christ. Because keep in mind, as you go through the Old Testament is actually, it's a picture, if you will, of what is going to happen in the life of the Messiah. You know, the nation of Israel was under the leadership of God himself, but the people weren't satisfied with that. They said, oh, we want to have a king just like all the other nations around us have a king. Now the Lord eventually allowed them to do it. He allowed them to do it, but he constantly warned them what would happen when they got a king. But nevertheless, there have been a lot of illustrations of who the King of Kings will be like, and what will happen to the King of Kings. Think about what happens here with Joash. Joash is that 7-year-old boy who is now the king. Look at all the things that happened to him. Number one, he was protected. He was protected. Notice the guards, the very minute that he was revealed to be the king, he was under protection. Think about what happened to Jesus. When he was a baby, what did God say to Mary and Joseph? Get him out of here. Take him to Egypt, because they wanted him to be protected from Herod. Because remember what Herod was doing? He was killing all these babies 2 years old and under. And so just like Joash was protected, Jesus was protected as an infant. But then later on he was revealed. When was Jesus revealed? Well, think about when he was what, 12 years old? And where did they see him when they figured out he wasn't with them as they were traveling back to Nazareth? They went back and they saw him debating the elders. They began to realize there's something different about this person. And later on, when he was 30 years of age, he comes walking toward the River Jordan. And what does John the Baptist say about him? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He was revealed. He was revealed for who he was. But not only was he revealed, just like Joash, and what they did to Joash, what does it say? That when they took him, they anointed him the king. You know, we saw that. They brought out the king's son in verse 12 here of chapter 11. They gave him the testimony, they proclaimed him king, and they anointed him. When was Jesus anointed? At his baptism. Remember what happened when he came up out of the water? Voice from heaven came and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And of course, the covenant was revealed at that Last Supper. Remember the covenant? This is the New Testament. This is the new covenant in my blood. So just as Joash was covenanted here before all the people, Jesus was also covenanted, if you will, when he said, this is the blood of my covenant, my new covenant. And then, of course, he was enthroned. When was he enthroned? When he went back to glory. Look at what it says in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1. Look at what it says. Beginning at verse 1 of Hebrews 1. It says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. That's when he is enthroned as king. He sits down. Where does he sit? He sits down at the throne on high. Very similar to what is said in Hebrews chapter 12. Notice what it says in Hebrews chapter 12. It says, looking unto Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So just like Joash went through all of these situations, protected, revealed, anointed, covenanted, and enthroned. So you kind of have this picture of what eventually is going to happen to the Messiah. So Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Now he's reigning over Judah, right? And remember what Jehu is doing. Jehu is reigning over Israel. All right, he killed all of Ahab's family, and now he's reigning. And it says, in the 7th year of Jehu, Joash began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abiah of Beersheba. And Joash, now you'll notice that, particularly in the ESV, it's spelled Jehoash, but it's the same. I call him Joash because it's easier to say. But nevertheless, Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all his days, because Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people continued to sacrifice and make offerings on the high places. And Joash said to the priest, all the money of the holy things that is brought into the house of the Lord, the money for which each man is assessed, the money from the assessment of persons, and the money that a man's heart prompts him to bring into the house of the Lord, let the priest take, each from his donor, and let them repair the house wherever any need of repairs is discovered. All right, so let's stop there for a minute and see now what is happening. We're told that Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and it says he decides to repair the temple. Now remember, all the way back, even in the book of Exodus, when the tithe was instituted, remember that God told them that each man was, every human being, once they reached 20 years of age, every male, once they reached 20 years of age, they were to give a half shekel to the temple. That was something that was like a temple tax that they were to pay. And so there was always that shekel. Every year they were to give that half shekel once they reached 20 years of age. And then of course there were times when they would make a pledge and they would give money. And then there were times when just out of a gratitude, they would thank the Lord for something good that happened to them, and they would come and they would bring an offering. So what were the priests to do with all of these offerings? Well, the priests would often use these offerings for their own upkeep, if you will, but they were also supposed to use it for the upkeep of the temple. Now, at this point in time, when Joash comes to the throne, the temple is well over 100 years old, approaching 150 years old. And keep in mind that so many times the people really ignored the temple. And you know, this is why the covenant had to be renewed, why often the prophets were there to try to encourage them to come back and worship in the temple like they were supposed to. So here's Joash, this young man now. He's saying, we need to make sure that the temple is repaired. It's been allowed to have fallen into disrepair. So look at what it says in verse 5. Let the priest take each from his donor, let them repair the house wherever any need of repairs is discovered. But by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priest had made no repairs on the house. All right, now 70-year-old Joash is now 30 years old. All right, this is the 23rd year of his reign. And the temple still hasn't been repaired. So what were they doing with the money? Verse 7. King Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priests and said to them, "Why are you not repairing the house? Now therefore take no more money from your donors, but hand it over for the repair of the house." So the priests agreed that they should take no more money from the people and that they should not repair the house, that they should not repair it. So in other words, don't take any more money and don't not repair the house. Then Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in the lid of it and set it beside the altar on the right side as one entered the house of the Lord. And the priest who guarded the threshold put in it all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. So, before they used to give the money to the priest. And Joash said, "Not anymore. Now we're going to put this chest just outside the door, kind of like what we do here. We don't pass the basket anymore, right? So anyway, they had this. They bored a hole in the chest. They said, "Okay, you can deposit your money, whether it's that half shekel every year." Or whether it's in response to the Lord for gratitude for something good that happened to you, put your money there. So then, what did they do? Go to verse 10. Whenever they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's secretary and the high priest came up, and they bagged and counted the money that was found in the house of the Lord. Then they would give the money that was weighed out into the hands of the workmen who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of the Lord, and to the masons and the stone cutters, as well as to buy timber and quarry stone for making repairs on the house of the Lord, and for any outlay for the repairs of the house. Now notice that there's a principle at work. It always was two people that counted the money. We do that as well. I mean, we never let just one person deal with the money of the church. Never, ever. And even the high priest couldn't do it alone. Why? Because there was always that temptation. There's always that temptation, and so in order to deal with that, there has to be at least two people that handles the church's money. Just like at least two were counting the money, and then they weighed it out. The reason it says that they weighed it out is because often they would be giving things like silver, and certain weights were worth a certain amount of money, so they would count it, and then they would give it to the workmen, and in order to keep all the repairs that were necessary to be made. Verse 13. But there were not made for the house of the Lord basins of silver, snuffers, bowls, trumpets, or any vessels of gold or silver from the money that was brought into the house of the Lord, for that was given to the workmen who were repairing the house of the Lord with us. So they made sure that the money went for what it was designated. It was not designated for these other parts of worship. That's what these basins of silver, the bowls, the trumpets, or any of the vessels, that money was not to be used for those. This was money that was designated specifically for the repair of the temple. So it says, and they did not ask for an accounting from the men into whose hand they delivered the money to pay out to the workmen, for they dealt honestly. So once they handed it over to the workmen, they wanted to make sure that these workmen would use the money for the repair of the temple. And how did they do that? They trusted them. They realized that these were men of honesty, and so they said, all right, here's the money, use it for the work, for the repair of the temple. Verse 16, for the money from the guilt offerings and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord, it belonged to the priests. So people still gave money for other things. You know, it's just like we have money for missions, but we also have money that's given for the upkeep, given money to pay the salaries of the staff and things of that nature. And the same thing was going on here. They had specific money that went into that chest that was just outside, and that all that went into that chest was used for the repair of the temple. And so there was always interest in maintaining the house of the Lord. Now, in 2 Chronicles, we're not going to turn there, we don't have time to turn there, but in 2 Chronicles, beginning in chapter 22, in chapter 22, 23, and 24, those 3 chapters of 2 Chronicles goes into a little more detail than what it says right here. Because keep in mind that Chronicles was kind of a book that recorded all of the incidents that happened, and more so than what is in Kings, we have kind of an overview, and in Chronicles there is more detail. So in chapters 22, 23, and 24, you'll see more of what we read about here in 11 and 12 of 2 Kings. So, when we get to verse 17 of chapter 12, we're back to what happened with the Syrians. Now, notice what it says in verse 17. At that time, Hazael, king of Syria, went up and fought against Gath and took it. But when Hazael set his face to go up against Jerusalem, Joash, king of Judah, took all the sacred gifts that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, the kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred gifts, and all the gold that was found in the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and he sent these to Hazael, king of Syria. Then Hazael went away from Jerusalem. Now here's Joash. He was one of the good kings of Judah, but he wasn't all good. Because look at what he did. Instead of trusting the Lord to give him victory over Syria, he decided to pay him off instead of trusting the Lord. And so he took all of this money that his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather had collected, and he gives it to the king of Syria. Verse 19. Now the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? There, that's what you'll see in 22, 23, and 24, 2 Chronicles. His servants arose and made a conspiracy and struck down Joash in the house of Millo on the way that goes down to Silla. Now, archaeologists have tried to find where is Silla. They haven't been able to find it. Now, obviously, it's a name that has escaped history. They don't exactly know where that is. But then it says in verse 21, it was Jozachar, the son of Shimi, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Shomer, his servants, who struck him down so that he died. And they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Amaziah, his son, reigned in his place. So we find here that Joash was murdered. Remember, he reigned for 40 years, so he was only 47 years old when he died. Here's why he died at 47. He was actually murdered. And then his son, Amaziah, reigned in his place. So what are we going to find out about Amaziah, Joash's son? Well, 2 weeks from today, we're going to look at chapters 13, 14, and we're going to look at 3 chapters the next time we meet, 13, 14, and 15. And of course, that'll be on April 12th, because next Sunday being Easter, we will not be having class. We'll be having 4 services next weekend. I'm going to try to get to the sunrise service. You know, I've been to our sunrise services before. It's really nice out there in the Rose Garden. And it's the same sermon that you get if you went inside. So if you're so inclined, I'll see you at the sunrise service next Sunday. But Lord willing, 2 weeks from today, we'll pick it up on chapter 13. Loving Father, again, we are so grateful for the Word of God that lives and abides forever. And I thank you for its truth. Thank you for its instruction. Thank you for the love that is displayed in its pages. Thank you for your grace and for your mercy. We're grateful, Lord, for the history that we have of the nation of Israel. And Father, help us not learn this history just for the sake of learning, but that we might realize how we need to focus our attention on you and you alone. Thank you for your wonderful grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your compassion and your love. Dismiss us from this time together with your blessing, we pray, and we'll give you the thanks for it all in Jesus' name.